This is a new installment on my efforts to completely reinvent the yard after it was destroyed by years of drought and an unspeakably gigantic specimen of the giant climbing rose mermaid that used to occupy, no pun intended, the entire side of this yard from my mailbox all the way across to the house, which kept me out of my own front yard for just under 2 years. It was a real bitch cutting that sucker down with Pat's help. But now I've been able to re-expose the yard, and what I'm doing is recreating the roses collection based on buried water-wise container gardens. When I first moved in, I had 170 roses here, almost all en route, but back then we were getting several hurricanes a year. There was minimal water restrictions, the yard was wet, and I slowly lost them by attrition because I simply would not water them as much as they need. Here's a Graham Thomas. It's in a 7-gallon pool bucket. I'm using mostly 7-gallon. This Nostrana is in a 5-gallon. Here's a Baronne Prevost in a 5-gallon. Here's a Mystery Red China I just bought in South Florida that's in a 5-gallon. And this is what I wanted to share with people. This is my newest victory. I've been able to expose this whole center, both by removing the mermaid rose initially and then removing an incredible quantity of Bidens. Many people call it Spanish needle. My friend Ryan and 2 of his friends came here a couple months ago, and we bartered one of my classes for a couple hours of weed pulling. The Biden started to come back, so I pulled it up. And my other nemesis here, a lot of my problems here aren't weeds, they're ornamentals that went apeshit. This perennial morning glory up here, Epomea acuminata, is something I deeply regret ever having purchased. Until I started to get this victory here, it had crawled across the ground and had reached the driveway, had consumed the fence, you couldn't get through the gate. I can't stress enough, if you live in Florida, don't buy Epomea acuminata. I got it from Logi's greenhouse, not knowing the plague it was going to be. A few days ago, I repainted all these edgings that had faded over the years in the center bed. Next, I'm going to target this skinny bed that hugs the Barfield White Climber and Marshall Neal. Here's a cavity I'm filling in. It used to be, when I first bought the house, my neighbor said this was a giant jacaranda that had just been cut down by the former owner, and it's now decayed and collapsed, which caused the collapse of the rocks that I built my first pond here with. But as I bury each water-wise container garden, say if it's a 7-gallon, it generates almost 2 7-gallon buckets of soil. So I'm using the waste soil to fill this pit, and I'll go ahead and reposition these original edgings that got consumed and were literally invisible because of the morning glory, and paint them white. And I'm going to be planting this bed probably with a mixture of perennials, possibly a couple shrub roses. What's going on in this new bed is right here beneath this rebar hoop is what I call Mary Jo's Mystery White Climber, which seems to be a climbing form of Puerto Rico. It's a little baby plant there she rooted for me. Here's Maggie in a 7-gallon bucket buried. Here's Abraham Darby. I forget who this is. I'm going to have to check. Oh, this is Rosa Machada. And this, believe it or not, is a chromatella that somehow survived in the ground all these years, being consumed by mermaid and weeds, that's now growing now that it's been exposed and getting fed. I don't know if it's apparent in this harsh sunlight, but the nasturtium borders are coming up beautifully. The bed's been heavily sprinkled with white sweet alyssum, and then yesterday I planted little tufts of baby snapdragons. Here's a tuft here. I bought a 10-cent packet of snapdragon seeds at Dollar Tree, and in a water-wise container garden starting tray I made, I had incredible germination, and they came up so close and so thick I won't try to separate them, and I kind of like the idea of a clump of mixed color snapdragons. This was the first victory bed. This has a Louisiana iris in a 4-gallon bucket, Baronne Prevost, and I'm now growing something I haven't grown in a couple years. It's called Lavatera trimestris. I think the nickname is rose mallow. I used to grow it in Denver. It's a winter annual here in Tampa, and I just simply direct sowed them in here with the compost. This bed is almost done. I just have to plant a few more rose buckets. There's going to be one going here where this mulch bucket is and the tools are. beneath this beautiful thriving papaya. And this time around, as I reinvent the yard, I'm making it far more of a permaculture. Before, it wasn't a monoculture of roses, but it was 170 roses. And roses are thirsty. This bed here, it looks bad, but it's actually not as bad as it looks. The only actual weed in here is this nasty, what I think is stargrass, which will come up quite readily as a clump. But there are several roses in here buried in water-wise container gardens. Here's a saffrano that was in bloom yesterday. And what's happening, I'll see if this will show up, is I have monstrous runners of my favorite rambler, Francois Gironde, which is snaked along the bed, which made it so hard to weed. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take a 20-foot section of rebar, and I'm going to span the tops of these two rebars, go right across like I used to have when I first bought the house, link it to this rebar here. I'm going to have one additional 10-foot section here, probably for rigidity, and I'm going to lift off the ground these long shoots of Francois Gironde and train them right across the top, which is what had happened before, except Mermaid consumed it. This is holy basil, which is actually proving to be invasive from reseeding. I cannot believe how freely it reseeds. Here's a gardenia in a water-wise container garden. I haven't decided where to plant it yet because they like shade. Over here is a Hansa rose that I bought from Pam Greenwald when I gave a presentation at a rose festival this spring. And by the way, I just had her here. She was a delight. She was here in Tampa to give a talk. One thing I want to cover over here next to the, oh, let's zoom in on Graham Thomas. I love, that's my favorite yellow rose. Down below him is a ground cover being grown by strawberry farmers here in Tampa for nematode control and to nitrify the soil. Its commercial name is sun hemp. It's a Crotalaria species. This one got blown over by the wind. It's normally very upright. Big, beautiful yellow flowers, extreme fragrance. I mean, truly wonderful fragrance. Wish it would have not gotten blown over. The roots exude something that suppress root knot nematode. I've got, here, let's go out front. I've got one that has survived the wind. Oh, this is a Celosia spicata, which I've grown very fond of. Extremely hassle-free and truly a beautiful flower. But let's take a look at this upright growing sun hemp. And that's spelled S-U-N-N if you want to Google it. I think it's Crotalaria lutea, but it's been hybridized. Here's my big, tall, upright one out front. It just started to flower. And again, I can't emphasize the fragrance. It's a sweet, almost a honey-like perfume. Get close to this bloom spike here. Put my hand in there for scale. I truly love this flower. And it's budding up like crazy. I planted this one quite late. I have to literally aim the camera up to get to the top, and in full bloom, unless it blows over, it should be spectacular. Here's a Malva sylvestre seedling that popped up on its own. It's thriving. It's an edible flower I grew in Colorado that I'm very fond of. Here's a late appearing plant of African foxglove, which is not really a foxglove. Its real name is Ceratotheca triloba. It wants dry, hot, and nasty conditions, and actually everyone in my garden came up in the brickwork this spring and needed to be moved. It hates good conditions. This is something wonderful I want to share. One of my students and longtime customers over in St. Pete, Janine, who buys eggs from me to hatch for her science students and gives me the chickens right back, brought over with her kids last Friday with this and 2 other Occupy a Yard signs she had made for me, which I thought was so sweet of her to do. The kids and her chose a close-up of blueberries for the background for this one. This is a new bed I'm putting in, edged by logs that were brought to me by a tree trimmer. This pile here is going out back to be buried underground, and I forget the German word, but it's an old gardening technique where you bury wood and it decays. And I'm dumping it into my old snail pond, and I'm turning it into a bog garden. This bed here has been planted with sweet alyssum, white sweet alyssum. I've got a border of nasturtiums behind the logs, and there's other annuals in there, cold weather annuals. I've got larkspur, I've got standing cypress, which is an experiment because I grew it in summer in Denver. Yesterday I snuck in, again, little clumps. Here's one here of those snapdragons that had come up so densely in that tray. And I figure by late January, this bed ought to be absolutely charming. Here's a Revamp climbing rose, which was one of the first prototypes I planted in a buried water-wise container garden. It's a 4-gallon one because the road subsurface is too close to the surface to let me bury a 5. Here's a new bud appearing on Revamp. There's Belinda's Dream on Fortuniana, one of only 3 roses I have on Fortuniana. The other being this Teasing Georgia, which just finished a nice flush. There's a bud here. Teasing Georgia is proving to be almost unmanageably vigorous on Fortuniana to the point that it's become a very fat climber. It looks to me like the wind's tipped it over. Here's another view of this bed. I'm going to be planting at least 1 rose here in this corner, possibly 2 if I take up that shampoo ginger, which is popping up from years ago. It's time to prune back heavily this Cassia alata. It's crowding out the plumeria. It's crowding out the pink cracker rose, and plus I don't want it to set 17 quadrillion seeds like it's getting ready to do. Oh, I see up here is Clitoria terniata, which makes beautiful edible blue flowers. Don't know if they'll show up here. It's going up a piece of rebar that eventually is going to be home to a climbing rose, probably New Dawn. Let's come back around, wrap things up. Oh, this is something cool I wanted to share. About 10 days ago, I was going to visit my gardening friend Pat and passed a business that had set out by the dumpster a tremendous amount, and I do mean tremendous amount, of this packing material, which I call wood wool. It's just simply thin shreds of what seems to be white pine. I literally filled most of the minivan to capacity, and I can't find the pictures I took of it with a still camera. But this is proving to be, as you'd expect, beautiful nesting material for both the chickens and the ducks, and I have so much. I am set for nesting for at least a year, if not 2 years. It was one of those wonderful rewards of being an observant dumpster diver. Let's come back over here. Here's the pond that I made from a rooftop camping shell that Pat gave me that he found on the roadside. I'm looking forward to reclaiming this bed, finishing it. I'm going to cut back the Cassia edulis. The colony's got a little too big, and as you can see, they're past prime. So I'm going to cut it back, dig up probably 2/3 of the clump because it's gotten too big and it's interfering with my Francois Gironvie rose. And once I weed in here, get that grass out and a little bit of Bidens, it'll be very apparent that there's a few bush roses in there. And once I get exposed, remulch and plant in nasturtiums, white alyssum, and some of the other annuals I'm starting from seed out back. So here's where we stand currently in my effort to reclaim my yard from the hell of mermaid, Epomia acuminata, 5 years of drought, my refusal to water, and the conversion to a very permacultural, polycultural garden based on roses, perennials, annuals, and some food crops. I can hardly wait to see it's done. The next target is that hellbed. Behind there, believe it or not, is a beautiful pond lined in limestone that I made years ago. And I'm going to take down that entire massive Pandoria vine, which I should have never planted. And I'm going to take down the rebar structure, and with some mixed feelings, I'm going to remove a beautiful plant of Rosa lavigata, the cherry key rose. I just do not like the fact that it's absolutely impassable, even though everything in there is either edible or beautiful. I want it to be opened up, and once the fish pond bed is exposed, which should happen in the next couple days, same thing, I'll be painting its edgings and putting in fresh mulch and start planting roses in there again in buried water-wise container gardens. So there's hope for me yet, guys. Bye-bye.